They played predator calls in the academy. The human smirked and said, "That's only the beginning." The sound hit us at 300 hours. No warning, no build-up, just a burst of raw, guttural noise that filled every corner of the barracks like a living thing pressing against the walls. It came from the ceiling speakers, from the floor vents, from everywhere at once. The lights stayed off. The sound just poured in and swallowed the dark hole. I was already awake. I had been lying on my bunk staring at the ceiling, thinking about nothing in particular, the way I always do when sleep decides it has better places to be. So I heard it from the very first second. A low, rolling growl that built into something sharp and wet, like the earth itself was clearing its throat before saying something terrible. Then it changed. It folded into a series of short, rhythmic clicking sounds, followed by a long descending wail that seemed designed to vibrate inside the chest rather than just the ears. Around me, every bunk in the room erupted. Sariath, my bunkmate, a Velhari with long silver-gray limbs and eyes that caught light like a cat's, dropped from her top bunk and hit the floor in a defensive crouch before she was even fully awake. Her crest, the narrow ridge of cartilage along the top of her head, fanned out wide. That meant fear, pure instinctive body-level fear. 3 bunks down, a Kreth cadet named Davrath, who was the size of a large wardrobe and covered in natural armored plating, pressed himself flat against the wall with his secondary arms curled tight against his torso. The Kreth were considered one of the 11 most capable warrior species in the known galaxy. He looked like someone had just told him the floor was going to disappear. Others were worse. A group of Felian cadets, small insect-like creatures with 6 limbs and translucent wings, had clustered together in the corner nearest the door. They were completely silent, which, I had learned in orientation, was what Felians did when they were most terrified. They went still and silent and hoped whatever was hunting them would stop noticing them. I sat up in my bunk. I tilted my head to the left. The sound changed again. A new layer entered, something deeper, more resonant, with a kind of slow patience to it, like a very old and very confident thing announcing that it had arrived and was in no hurry to leave. I said out loud to no one in particular, "That last one sounds like a cave bear warming up before it gets actually annoyed." Nobody answered me. Nobody could. The room was operating entirely on instinct, and instinct, for most of the species present, was saying one very clear thing: do not move, do not speak, do not exist too loudly. I looked at Sariath. She was still crouched on the floor, her pale eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling, her breathing shallow and controlled in the way you breathe when your body is preparing to run very fast in any available direction. I swung my legs over the side of my bunk and sat there, listening properly. The sounds continued for another 4 minutes. They cycled through what I would later learn was a library of 11 distinct predator calls, sourced from 11 different species of apex fauna from across 30 inhabited worlds. The curriculum designers had chosen them with care. Each one was documented to trigger a measurable stress response in the maximum possible range of known species' nervous systems. The Valkyrie cry, which sounded like metal tearing underwater, affected 9 of the 12 species in our barracks. The Drelshan bone resonance, that deep cycling pressure wave, affected 11 of 12. I was the 12th. When the lights came back on, exactly 7 minutes after the sounds had started, the room looked like the aftermath of something. Cadets were scattered against walls, huddled in corners, some on the floor. Sariath was only now beginning to straighten up from her crouch. Davrath had not moved from his position against the wall, though his secondary arms were slowly uncurling. I was sitting on the edge of my bunk with my feet dangling, and my head still tilted slightly to the left. Instructor Velra walked in exactly 30 seconds later. She was Kethalari, a species that resembled a tall, broad-shouldered human if you replaced the skin with something smoother, and gave the eyes an extra half centimeter of iris. She had the kind of posture that suggested she had been giving orders since before some of us were born, which, given that her species lived approximately 240 years, was likely true. She carried a datapad in one hand. She looked around the room slowly. She was clocking every cadet's position, their posture, their biometric readings on her device. She stopped when she got to me. I met her eyes. She looked at the datapad. She looked at me again. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Cadet Voss, my office, 700. She left. Sariath looked at me from the floor, still breathing carefully. "What," she said, "just happened to you?" I thought about it. "Nothing," I said honestly. "That's the problem. My name is Mara Voss. I am 23 years old, from a mid-sized city in the north of England called Durham, which sits beside a river and under skies that are gray approximately 230 days a year. I grew up walking in forests. I grew up hearing sounds in the dark and learning to identify them rather than fear them. My grandmother taught me to name things. She said that a thing you can name has less power over you than a thing you can only feel. I grew up naming things in the dark. I was one of 2 humans admitted to the Galactic Alliance Officer Academy in the cycle I applied. The other was a young man named Owen Clark from New Zealand, who had been placed in the engineering track and lived in a different barracks block. I had not spoken to him since orientation day, but I had seen him across the common area twice. He had the same look I probably had, slightly amused, slightly puzzled by everyone else's reactions to things. Humans had been admitted to the Alliance only 11 years prior. Our world had been assessed, observed, and debated for decades before that. The admission had been described, in the formal diplomatic language of the Alliance Council, as a necessary inclusion given Earth's strategic position and undeniable developmental trajectory. In the less formal language that cadets actually used, we were the new ones, the odd ones, the species that everyone was still figuring out how to categorize. Most of the faculty had been briefed on us. Most of the briefings I had gathered were incomplete. The predator calls had stopped. The barracks were quiet. Around me, 11 species of future military officers were slowly returning to their bodies, their hearts slowing, their instincts standing down. I lay back down on my bunk. I listened to the silence where the sounds had been. I thought those were good sounds, impressive range. Whoever built that library had real knowledge of acoustic fear response architecture. Then I thought, I wonder what the bears back home would make of the Valkyrie call. Probably nothing. Probably they would just keep walking. I closed my eyes. At 700, I knocked on instructor Velra's office door, and the next chapter of my life at the academy began. I knocked twice and waited. Velra's voice came through the door, calm and even, telling me to enter. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Her office was not what I expected. I had assumed it would be functional, sparse, the kind of space that said, "I work here, I do not live here, there is a difference." It was functional, yes, but the walls held things, not decorations exactly, more like evidence. A mounted weapon from a species I did not recognize, its blade shaped in a long, curving sweep. A framed document in 4 languages, one of which was Alliance Standard and 3 of which I could not read. A small, dark stone on the corner of her desk, with a groove worn into it from what looked like decades of a thumb tracing the same path. Velra herself was standing, not sitting. She held the datapad she had carried into the barracks, but she had set it on the desk and was not looking at it. She was looking at me. "Sit down, cadet," she said. I sat. She studied me for a moment the way you study a document you have read 3 times and still cannot fully make sense of. Then she picked up the datapad and turned it toward me. On the screen was a long data file. At the top in Alliance Standard, it read, Species Profile Homo sapiens Human. Class 4 Hostile Biosphere Origin. Threat Assessment. Ongoing Review. "I pulled your species file this morning," she said. "I have read it twice. I want to ask you some questions and I want honest answers, not diplomatic ones. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. She set the datapad down. The predator call exercise is standard for all incoming cohorts. It has been used for 62 years. In 62 years, across 47 cohorts, every cadet from every species on record has shown a measurable stress response to at least 3 of the 11 calls. Every cadet. She paused. Your biometric data showed no stress response to any of the 11. I nodded. None, she said again, as if she wanted to make sure I understood the weight of the word. I heard them, I said. I know what they are. I just did not feel threatened by them. Why not? This was the question I had been thinking about since 300, on and off, between then and now. I had been trying to find a way to explain it that would make sense to someone who had not grown up where I grew up, inside what I had grown up inside. I was not sure there was a clean way to do it, so I decided to just be direct. The sounds were impressive, I said, genuinely. Whoever compiled that library understood acoustic predator signaling very well. But the thing is, most of those sounds, the Valkyrie cry, the Drelshen resonance, the high-frequency Pelith screech, they are all signals that an animal makes to frighten prey into moving. The sounds are designed to cause panic and flight so that the predator can track the movement. They only work on prey. Velra was very still. You are saying you did not respond because you did not identify as prey. I am saying my nervous system did not identify as prey, I said. It is not a decision I made. It is just what happened. Or rather, what did not happen. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up the datapad again and read from it. Earth megafauna, pre-extinction list. Cave lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths. She looked up. Every large predator on your world's prehistorical record is extinct. Most of them, yes. The file attributes this to climate shift and ecosystem pressure. I said carefully, the file is being diplomatic. Velra set the datapad down again. Your species hunted them. Yes. To extinction. In most cases, yes. Though with some species there were other pressures too, but the hunting was a significant factor. She looked at me for a long time. These were apex predators, animals at the top of their food chains, creatures that your species at the time would have had no technological advantage over. Correct, we used coordination, persistence. We would follow prey for days, taking turns, never letting it rest until it exhausted itself. We were not faster than most of them. We were not stronger. We just would not stop. And then, she said, reading again, you domesticated the survivors. Some of them, the ones that could be worked with. She turned the datapad toward me again. There was a photograph on the screen. A large, wide-shouldered, deep-chested animal with a thick coat and a calm, open expression. A dog. Specifically, a Newfoundland, one of the larger breeds, sitting beside a child about half its height. This, she said, descended from the gray wolf, which your species also hunted near extinction and then, at some point, instead decided to adopt. Yes. You made it sleep in your homes. At the foot of the bed, usually. Sometimes on the bed, depending on the dog and the owner. Velra placed the datapad face down on her desk. She pressed the tips of her fingers together. It was a Kethalari gesture I had not seen before. I learned later that it was something their people did when they were processing a thought they found difficult to organize. Cadet Voss, she said, what do you do on your world for recreation, for leisure, when there is no work, no training, no requirement on your time? I thought about this. Many things: read, spend time with family, cook. And outdoors. Walk, mostly hike, camp. Define camping. I paused. We go into the wilderness voluntarily, usually forests or mountains or coastal areas with difficult terrain. We carry minimal equipment. We sleep outside in temporary shelters or under open sky. We make fires. We stay for several days, sometimes weeks. Velra's fingers pressed together more tightly. You go voluntarily into environments that contain large predatory fauna. Yes. Intentionally, for enjoyment. Yes. And when the predatory fauna approaches your camp. I thought about every camping trip I had ever taken, about the time the red fox had stolen half our food from the tent in the Lake District, about the time in Scotland when we had heard the stags fighting nearby in the dark, their antlers crashing together, and my father had poured another cup of tea and said, quietly, "Good, that's a healthy herd." About the time in Canada, on a trip I had taken at 19, when a black bear had wandered into the edge of our campsite, and we had stood very still and watched it for 11 minutes before it lost interest and left. We make noise to signal our presence, I said, or we stay still and observe. It depends on the animal, the situation, the distance. Velra stood up. She walked to her window, which looked out over the academy's central courtyard. Morning light, pale and slightly blue-tinted from the station's filtered solar panels, lay across the stone below in long rectangles. Your world, she said, without turning around, was classified by the Alliance Environmental Survey as a Class 4 hostile biosphere. That classification means that the natural environment is dangerous enough that survival for an unprepared, non-adapted visitor is considered unlikely. The survival projection for an unequipped Alliance observer in your northern wilderness zones is 11% over a 30-day period. I said nothing. 11%, she repeated. And your people go there voluntarily for leisure, with a canvas shelter and a fire. It is quite peaceful, I said honestly, when you know what you are listening for. Velra turned from the window. She looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, not quite fear, not quite respect, something that lived in the narrow space between those two things, where they almost touch. You said last night that the sounds were like a cave bear warming up, as though that was a familiar frame of reference. I have heard bears before, I said. In person, they are loud, but they are also mostly reasonable. They want food or space or to be left alone. If you do not threaten them and you do not run, most of the time they move on. Velra sat back down. She picked up a stylus and held it, turning it slowly in her fingers. Most of the time, she said. Most of the time, I agreed. And the other times? I thought of my grandmother, who had been charged by a boar once in a wood in Yorkshire, and had hit it with her walking stick until it turned and left. She had been 64 years old at the time. The other times, I said, you deal with it. There was a long silence. Outside in the courtyard, a group of cadets from the morning early shift were moving across the stone in formation. I watched them through the window behind Velra's head. Orderly, precise, trained. Velra said, I would like you to remain available for additional assessment this week. Not punitive, not corrective. I simply want to understand what I am working with. Of course, I said. She looked at me one more time. Cadet Voss, when you were lying on your bunk at 300, listening to 11 predator calls that have collectively caused documented panic responses in over 4,000 individuals across 30 recorded cohorts, what were you actually thinking? I considered lying. I considered a diplomatic non-answer. I decided against both. I was thinking, I said, that the Drelshen resonance was the most technically interesting one. The frequency band it uses is actually in a range that human infrasound research identified as a psychological stress trigger about 200 years ago. We found it in old cathedrals. Some architects used it accidentally. It makes people feel like something is present in the room that they cannot see. Velra stared at me. We called it the ghost frequency, I said. We built churches that made people feel it and called it the presence of God. I paused. I thought whoever put that library together had done their homework. Velra set the stylus down very carefully on the desk. Dismissed, she said. Her voice was perfectly level, but her hand, when she released the stylus, stayed flat on the desk for a moment longer than it needed to. I stood, nodded, and walked out. In the corridor outside, I stopped and leaned against the cool wall for a moment, alone. I thought about the sounds again. The Valkyrie cry, the Drelshan bone resonance, 11 predator signals from 30 worlds, assembled by experts to represent the most universally feared sounds in the biological record. I thought about Durham, about the river at night, about the woods in winter when the wind moves through bare branches and makes sounds that are almost words. I pushed off the wall and walked toward the morning, toward the light filling the end of the corridor. Behind me, in Velra's office, I heard the sound of her picking up the datapad again. I kept walking. The night exercise began at 2100. There was no briefing beyond the basics. Velra had given us 23 words at dinner. You will be placed on the moon's surface at marked coordinates. Extract to the beacon. The first one out has no required debrief. That was all. 23 words and then silence. The moon was called Velkarath 3 in the station's operational catalog. Nobody called it that. The cadets called it the Gray because everything on its surface existed in shades of gray and silver. Low gravity, roughly 40% of Earth standard. Dense, slow-rolling fog that came from the geothermal vents in the rock. A thin but breathable atmosphere, heavily filtered through our suit systems. Temperature just below comfortable. And fauna simulated, introduced by the Academy's exercise team, ranging from small skittish things to larger constructs designed to behave like territorial predators. I had my suit, my standard cadet kit, and a short-range scanner that I almost immediately switched off. The scanner pinged every 15 seconds. Pinging was noise. Noise in unfamiliar dark terrain was an advertisement. I switched it off and used my visor's passive thermal overlay instead. The drop capsule doors opened. I stepped out. Behind me, I heard other capsules opening across a 50-meter spread. I heard the sounds of cadets adjusting to the gravity, to the fog, to the quiet. Low gravity always took a moment to recalibrate for species adapted to heavier pulls. I felt it myself, the slight extra spring in each step, the way the world seemed to want to give you more than you asked for. I did not wait. The others were already clustering. I could hear it without turning, the murmur of coordination, the exchange of glow markers, the instinct toward the group. Every pack animal, every herd species, every creature that had evolved safety in numbers had that response. I understood it. I did not share it. I moved into the fog alone. The thing about fog is that it works both ways. It hides you from the things looking for you, but it also hides them from you. The question is what you do with that uncertainty. Most species respond to limited visibility by reducing movement, increasing sound awareness, and staying in proximity to others. That strategy makes sense if the primary threat is a single large predator hunting by movement or scent. If everything stays still and quiet together, the predator has a harder time isolating a target. The problem with that strategy in a training exercise with a mapped extraction point is that staying still and quiet together means staying lost together. And lost together, in the dark, on an unfamiliar surface with simulated fauna programmed to respond to clustered biological signatures, was exactly where the exercise designers would want you. I moved in a wide, loose arc. Low gravity meant I could cover ground with less noise than on Earth. Each footfall was lighter, more controlled. I kept my breathing even and shallow, not because I was frightened, because breathing produces fog in cold air, and fog from your own breath at eye level obscures your sightlines. My grandmother had taught me that too. She had been very practical. After 12 minutes, I had the beacon's direction fixed from 2 passive landmark triangulations. A thermal vent cluster to the northeast, and the station's light scatter above the cloud ceiling. Navigation without active instrumentation was something I had practiced since I was a child, mostly because it was a skill my grandfather considered essential, and he had a gift for making things he considered essential seem interesting. I moved toward the beacon. At the 19-minute mark, I heard it. Something large was moving through the fog to my left at roughly 20 meters. The thermal overlay gave me an outline, a drone construct, roughly 4 times my volume, moving on 6 articulated legs with the low, careful deliberateness of something that was not walking from one place to another, but was instead covering territory. Searching. The exercise team had programmed it to respond to movement. Fast movement triggered pursuit. Slow movement triggered approach and assessment. Stillness triggered timeout and move on after approximately 3 minutes. I stopped walking. I turned to face it directly. The construct moved through the fog toward me with the same slow, patient confidence that the largest animals always carry. The confidence of something that has never needed to hurry because there has never been anything that required it to. It stopped at about 8 meters. Its forward sensors, designed to mimic biological eyes, were fixed on me. I stood still. I breathed slowly. I looked at it. This was the part that people found strange about humans, the looking. Most species, when confronted by a large predatory animal or construct, drop the eyes. Looking away is submission. It is the signal that says, "I am not a challenge. Please move on." It works often. Predators are generally not interested in things that are not fighting back or running. Humans look. We look because our ancestors looked. Because sustained eye contact with a predator is also a signal, one that says, "I see you. I am aware of you. I am not surprised by you, and I am not leaving." It is a very different kind of message. The construct's sensors stayed fixed on me for 4 minutes and 27 seconds. I know the exact time because the exercise report detailed it later. The handler monitoring it from the control room later told Velra, and Velra later told me that she had assumed my suit systems had malfunctioned, because no cadet had ever done that before. Most cadets, when the construct found them, either froze for a few seconds and then bolted, or tried to retreat quietly. None had simply stopped and looked. At 4 minutes and 28 seconds, the handler overrode the construct and recalled it. I watched it turn and walk away into the fog. Then I turned and continued toward the beacon. I reached it at 38 minutes and 40 seconds. The second cadet to arrive was Davrath. He came out of the fog at 1 hour, 19 minutes and 51 seconds, armored plating slightly scuffed, secondary arms crossed tight against his body. He stopped when he saw me sitting on a rock beside the beacon, my visor up, drinking from my water canteen. He looked at me for a long time. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "A while," I said. He sat down heavily on the rock beside me. He was silent for several minutes. We could hear, faintly through the fog, the sounds of other cadets still navigating, glow markers pulsing, voices, some of them urgent. "You went alone," Davrath said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." "The construct found you," he said. "I saw it on the environmental scanner before mine cut out. It tracked right to your position." "Yes." "What did you do?" I thought about how to answer. "I waited," I said, "and I looked at it." Davrath was quiet for a moment. Among the Kreth, silence was considered a form of response. It meant the words were being measured carefully. "You looked at it," he said. Direct eye contact. I stayed still and I looked at it until it moved on. Another silence, longer this time. "Where I come from," Davrath said, "looking directly at a predator is a declaration of contest. It means you are willing to fight." "Where I come from," I said, "it means something similar, but it also means something else. It means I am not prey. I see you, and I am not afraid, and I am not running, and if you come closer you should be very clear about what that means for both of us." Davrath turned to look at me properly. In the pale light from the station above, his plating had a dark, polished sheen. His eyes, wide-set and copper-colored, were direct and serious. "And the construct backed down," he said. The handler recalled it, but yes, essentially. Davrath was quiet for another long moment. Then he said something that I had not expected. He said, I have fought in 3 live training engagements and 1 real border incident. I have never looked a predator directly in the eye without meaning to attack it immediately after. We are taught that eye contact without action is instability, a gap in intent. It can be, I said, or it can be confidence. The difference is in how you hold yourself. He looked out into the fog. More glow markers were appearing now, moving toward the beacon in pairs and small groups. The herd had started to find its way. Cadet Voss, Davrath said slowly, what exactly are your people? I took another sip of water and thought about that. It was a question I had been asked in different ways before. By Velra, by Sariath, by 3 different cadets in orientation week who had read some fragments of Earth's public record and had come away with more questions than they had started with. I thought about my grandmother with her walking stick, about my grandfather with his compass, about my father pouring tea while stags fought in the Scottish dark, about the 11 predator calls that had not moved me and the construct in the fog that had walked away. We are the reason, I said quietly, that your ancestors' predators are not here anymore. We won. A very long time ago, against everything that the world put in front of us across a very long time in very many different ways. We won. I paused. We just never really stopped. Davrath said nothing. He looked at me for a long time with those copper-colored eyes. Then slowly, with the deliberateness of someone doing something they had thought carefully about, he moved aside on the rock, making space. We sat in the fog together and waited for the others to find their way home. The seminar room held 32 cadets in a curved arrangement of seats facing a raised central platform. The walls were transparent from the inside, showing a panoramic view of the station's outer ring and the stars beyond. It was a design choice that felt significant, a reminder, every session, of what was outside and why the work inside mattered. Professor Aron ran the History of Conflict seminar. He was Velhari like Sariath, but older, with the subdued coloring of his species in its later decades, silver-gray where younger Velhari had blue-white. He had a careful, thorough manner of speaking, never rushing, always watching the room as he talked, checking for understanding the way a good teacher does. The assignment had been given 2 weeks earlier. Each cadet would present the defining conflict in their species' history, the moment or the extended period that had most shaped how their people thought about struggle, endurance, and survival. We each had 20 minutes. I was the last to go. The presentations before mine had been extraordinary in their variety. The Kreth sent Davrath, naturally, and he gave a composed, detailed account of the Kreth unification wars, 3 centuries of internal conflict that had ultimately produced the cohesive warrior culture they were known for today. The Velhari representative, a cadet named Suri who had not spoken much outside of class, delivered a quiet and devastating account of the long containment, a 200-year period in which her people had managed the collapse of a failing star system within their home territory, evacuating populations at enormous cost, and holding their political structure together through measures that had required extraordinary endurance of spirit. The Felian cadets presented collectively, in the way their species communicated best, layered, simultaneous voices that the translator rendered into a single coherent narrative about their silence wars, in which their people had fought not with weapons, but with the withdrawal of all communication and cooperation from occupying forces, until the occupation collapsed from its own internal contradictions. Each presentation was remarkable. Each revealed something about a species, what they valued, what they had suffered, what they considered worth preserving. When Professor Aron called my name, I walked to the platform. I stood there for a moment and looked at the room. 32 faces, 32 species, 32 histories. I said, I need to begin by explaining a problem, which is that I do not know which one to choose. Professor Aron tilted his head. Please elaborate. Every species that has presented today described a defining conflict. 1. a central event or era that shaped everything after it. I understand the assignment. I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I paused. Humans have never stopped having conflicts. There is no single defining one. There are thousands. They have been continuous, overlapping, and simultaneous for as long as we have written records, and our oral histories suggest the same for a very long time before that. The room was quiet. I am going to do my best, I said, to give you a shape of it. Not a single event, but the pattern, because the pattern is what explains us. I pulled up the first display. A timeline simplified, a single horizontal line with marks along it. 12,000 years ago, roughly, we began settled agriculture. Within 1,000 years of that, we had standing armies. Within 2,000 years, we had organized city-states fighting each other over resources, territory, and power. Within 4,000 years, we had continent-spanning empires rising and falling in cycles. Within 6,000 years, we had developed long-range weapons capable of striking enemies we could not see. Within 8,000 years, we had begun industrializing conflict, building dedicated facilities for producing weapons, training fighters, and sustaining military campaigns across enormous distances. I moved to the next display. 10,000 years after settled agriculture, we had split the atom. We had built devices capable of destroying cities in a single use. We had used 2 of them. Within 10 years of that, we had enough of those devices to end all complex life on our planet several times over. The room had gone very still. Professor Arend said quietly, "And yet your species survived." "And yet we survived," I agreed. In fact, the existence of those devices, paradoxically, created one of the longest periods of non-direct conflict between our major powers that we had ever experienced. Approximately 45 years of what we called Cold War, a state of continuous, intense, existential tension between the 2 most powerful factions on our world, during which neither side used the ultimate weapons because both sides understood that doing so would mean the destruction of everything, including themselves. "You stabilized your civilization," said Professor Arend slowly, "by threatening to destroy it." "Essentially," I said, "we called it mutually assured destruction. The acronym was MAD, which most humans agreed was an appropriate word." A sound moved through the room. I was not sure what it was exactly. Not laughter. Something more complicated, the sound of people processing something they had not expected. I moved to the next display. A series of images from across human history, not combat scenes, but the things built between conflicts. Cities, libraries, medical facilities, schools, artwork, music. The layered, complicated record of a species that built and destroyed and built again. "Here is what I think the pattern actually shows," I said. "It is not that we are violent. Many species are capable of violence. The pattern is persistence. We have been fighting, rebuilding, adapting, and continuing for 12,000 documented years, without ever reaching a point where we decided that the project of civilization was not worth continuing. We have been, at various points, close. Pandemics that removed significant portions of our population. Conflicts that destroyed centuries of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure. Environmental pressures that required wholesale relocation of millions of people. Famines, disasters, collapses." I looked around the room. We kept going, not because we were certain it would get better. Sometimes we kept going while being quite clear-eyed about how bad things were. We kept going because stopping is not something we seem to be built for. "I want to tell you about one specific thing," I said. "Not a conflict, a kind of person who comes from conflict." I pulled up the final display. No image, just text. "We have warriors who return from intense combat with lasting damage to their minds. The experiences they have endured leave marks that do not go away. They have difficulty sleeping. They respond to ordinary sounds as though they are threats. They carry the weight of what they saw and did and could not prevent, and that weight does not lift easily. We have a name for this condition. We study it. We have built entire systems of support around helping these individuals recover. I paused. These same individuals, after experiencing this, frequently volunteer to return to conflict zones, not because they are unaware of what happened to them, not because they have forgotten, but because they have people they want to protect, and the fact that the work is painful is not, to them, a sufficient reason to leave it to someone else. The room was completely silent. I thought of every soldier I had ever read about in every war across every continent, the ones who went back, the ones who wrote letters home while knowing they might not send them, the ones who carried damage and carried on. I do not know how to make that fully comprehensible, I said honestly. I am not sure I fully comprehend it myself, but I think it is the center of the pattern. Humans are capable of being broken by experience, and we are also capable of continuing despite being broken, and sometimes we continue because of what the breaking taught us about what matters. Professor Aaron was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on a Velhari face before. His crest was still, completely still. He said, "Cadet Voss, one question." "Of course." "When your people built the weapons capable of ending your world, and then chose, for the most part, not to use them, what was the deciding factor? What held you back?" I thought about this carefully. "Several things," I said. "Fear of retaliation, political calculation, economic interconnection, genuine moral reasoning in some individuals and moments, the understanding that there would be no winning, only ending." I paused. But I think, if I am being completely honest, the most consistent factor was something simpler. We looked at our children. We looked at what we were building, what we had built, what our people had managed to create between all the conflicts. The music, the cities, the medicine, the stories, the accumulated knowledge of 12,000 years of trying, and we decided it was worth more than the argument. The silence stretched. Sariath from her seat 3 rows back, said softly, almost to herself, "You are a very strange species." I looked at her. "Yes," I said, "we are." Professor Aaron said quietly to the room, "No further questions for this cadet." He looked at me. "You have 11 minutes remaining. What do you want to do with them?" I stepped down from the platform and walked back to my seat. "I think," I said, settling in, "that it has all been said." The day of the graduation combat trials, the board in the main assessment hall listed 64 names, paired by the Academy's algorithmic matching system. The system weighted species' physical capabilities, training scores, tactical assessment results, and what it called adaptability coefficients, which was a polite way of saying it tried to match people such that neither side had an obviously insurmountable advantage. My name was paired with Davrath's. The board showed the odds assessment below each pairing. For most pairs, the numbers were relatively close, 60-40, 55-45. The algorithm tried for competitive matches. For ours, it said, Voss 4%, Davrath 96%. I stood in front of the board for a moment and looked at those numbers. Then I took a dry erase marker from the tray below the board, reached up, and erased them. A Felian cadet standing nearby made a small, startled sound. I capped the marker, replaced it in the tray, and walked to the preparation area to change. The assessment hall was full when the match began. This was not unusual for the graduation trials. Family representatives from various species were attending through the observation gallery, and the full faculty were present. But the room felt different for this one. I could feel it as I walked to the floor. A kind of focused attention. The kind that happens when a room of people who understand odds are watching something they believe they already know the outcome of. Davrath stood across the floor from me. Full Kreth combat configuration, primary arms extended, secondary arms positioned for close-range grappling, armored plating fully articulated. He was a full head taller than me, significantly broader, with the kind of physical presence that did not need to do anything to communicate capability. Just standing there, he was an argument. He looked at me across the floor. I looked back at him. Something passed between us in that look, the acknowledgement of two people who had sat in the fog together and already, in some sense, understood each other. This was not personal. It was a test. We both knew that. The starting tone sounded. Davrath moved forward at standard engagement pace, controlled, not rushing, the textbook Kreth opening. Measure the ground, establish the center, wait for the opponent to reveal their strategy. I did not move toward him. I moved sideways. Not retreating, not circling in the conventional sense. Moving at an angle that was slightly unexpected, slightly off the line he had set, in a way that required him to recalculate the center without a clean adjustment. Small thing. But in the first 10 seconds of a combat assessment, small things are what you have. He adjusted. He was good, very good. His recalibration was fast, and his secondary arms shifted position to account for the new angle without his primary stance changing visibly. 3 years of academy training on top of a lifetime of species-specific combat conditioning. The room, watching, was tracking every move. I let him close the distance. He landed the first strike. A controlled impact to my right shoulder, holding back from full Kreth force, as the rules required but still substantial. I absorbed it and moved with it rather than against it, spinning the momentum into a step rather than letting it drop me. My shoulder registered the impact as significant. My body's response to it, the small involuntary signal that said this is damage and damage should stop you, I acknowledged and then set aside. Pain is information. It tells you where the problem is. It does not tell you what to do about the problem. Those are two different things, and most species, in my observation, have difficulty separating them quickly under pressure. We separated. I kept moving. Not fast, not in a way that was designed to impress, just constantly, always at a slight angle, always requiring him to recalculate. He landed 2 more controlled strikes over the following 3 minutes. I did not fall. I did not stop moving. Each time I took the impact, assessed, adjusted, and continued. I saw something shift in Davrath's approach around the 4-minute mark. His secondary arms changed configuration. A small but meaningful adjustment that told me he was updating his read of the situation. He had expected, based on physics and training data and 4,000 years of Kreth warrior knowledge, that 3 solid strikes on an unarmored opponent would produce a measurable reduction in their capacity to continue. It had not. He was recalculating what that meant. I was waiting for that recalculation. When it came, when I saw the fractional pause that indicated his system of predictions was being revised, I moved in rather than away. Close quarters are different from striking distance. In close quarters, the Kreth's secondary arms become their primary asset. They are faster, more flexible, and designed for exactly this range. The textbook answer against a Kreth was to never close to that range. I closed, but I did not come in straight. I came in low and to the left below the natural sweep line of his secondary arms, and I targeted the one structural gap in standard Kreth combat plating, a narrow zone at the lateral torso, below the lower articulation point, where the plates cannot fully overlap. It is not a weakness. It is a concession, a necessary design compromise, and it requires very precise positional knowledge to take advantage of it. I had spent 6 weeks studying Kreth anatomy in the Academy's reference library. I did not have the strength to do damage there through the plating. I was not trying to. I was applying sustained pressure to a point that, according to the physiology files, produced a significant proprioceptive disruption, a kind of feedback confusion in the Kreth sensory network that interfered with the coordination of the plating articulation. Davrath adjusted immediately, but for 3 seconds his plating configuration stuttered. In those 3 seconds I had moved behind him, and I had the specific grip and leverage hold that the Academy's unarmed combat manual designated as a compliance submission for opponents with external armor. The hold required absolute commitment and the willingness to accept the position it placed you in, which was temporary and controlled vulnerability. I committed. Davrath went through the correct countersequence perfectly. Then he went through the backup countersequence. Then there was a pause, because there was no third countersequence in the manual for the specific positional combination I was maintaining, and his training had not encountered it before. 11 minutes after the starting tone, Davrath signaled concession. The room was very quiet. He stood up, rolling his shoulders and resetting his plating. I stepped back and gave him the full clear. He turned and looked at me. And his expression was something I had not seen on a Kreth face before, not defeat, not embarrassment, but genuine inquiry. The face of someone who has been given information they cannot yet categorize. "You absorbed 3 primary strikes," he said. "Yes." "No degradation in function." "I registered them," I said. "I chose not to let them stop me." "How?" "I considered this. Humans have a high tolerance for continued effort under physical stress," I said. "We are not the most durable species physically. We break the same way everything breaks, but we have been developing for a very long time the ability to decide that the break is not the ending. We decide to continue. We have practiced deciding to continue for so long that it has become, for most of us, the default." Davrath was quiet for a moment. The room around us was still holding its collective breath. He said, "In the Kreth tradition, when a warrior defeats someone who was not expected to win, they offer the opponent the courtesy of an acknowledgement, of seeing them truly." He paused. "I see you, Mara Voss. I see what you are." I held his gaze. "Thank you," I said. "I see you too, Davrath. You fought with everything you were trained to bring, and you brought it well." We stood there for a moment in the quiet room. Then Velra's voice came from the faculty platform, steady and clear. "The graduation combat trials have concluded for this cohort. Before dismissal, I will make one address to the full assembly." We all turned. Velra stood at the front of the hall, the observation gallery full behind her, the stars visible through the outer walls. She held no datapad now. She had nothing in her hands. She spoke from memory, and her voice carried. "I reviewed every accessible document on the human species following my first conversation with Cadet Voss 11 weeks ago. I read environmental surveys, biological assessments, diplomatic contact reports, cultural indices, and historical records. The review took 4 weeks, working evenings. At the end of it, I had a collection of facts that individually were each interesting, and collectively were something else." She looked across the hall. "I was looking for a beginning. I wanted to find the moment when humans became what they are, the point on the timeline where they shifted from something ordinary into whatever this is. I read forward and backward through 12,000 years of documented history, and further back through archaeological records that went further still." She paused. "There was no beginning. There was no moment of transformation. There was no event that created them. They arrived into the historical record already as they are. Whatever they are, they were already it. They have always been it." The hall was silent, completely silent. 64 cadets and 40 faculty in a gallery full of observers, and not a sound. Velra reached forward and activated the audio system. The predator calls began. All 11 of them in sequence, filling the graduation hall the way they had filled the barracks 11 weeks ago. The Valkyrie cry, the Drelshan resonance, the Pelith screech, each one in turn moving through the air of the room. Around the hall the responses came. Subtle mostly. This was a room full of trained officers who understood what was happening and were managing themselves accordingly. But the tells were there. The tension in certain postures, the instinctive shifts in weight, the crest of a Velhari cadet going slightly wide before being pulled back under control. I sat in my chair. I leaned back. I listened to the sounds. And I smiled. Sariath was beside me. After 11 weeks of daily proximity, she no longer went wide-eyed at my reactions to things, but she still watched them with a kind of careful attention that told me she was still, always, updating her understanding. "You keep smiling at those sounds," she said quietly, beneath the predator calls. "I know," I said. "Why?" The Valkyrie cry rose and fell. The Drelshian resonance moved through the floor and the walls. "Because those are sounds from the shallow end," I said. "Those are the sounds of things that are looking for something easy, something that will run, something that has not decided yet whether it is going to stand." I listened to the next call rise. I grew up on a world that makes those sounds as background noise. Sariath was quiet for a moment. Then she asked carefully, "Is there something worse? Something that your world made that was more than these?" The graduation hall was filling with the final, layered combination of all 11 calls playing simultaneously. The exercise designer's maximum setting, the total effect, the full weight of 11 species worth of biological dread compressed into a single sustained sound. I thought about what lived in the deep parts of the oceans before we found them. I thought about the things that had walked across the continents when the ice was retreating, and we were walking with them. I thought about the long, patient terror of ice ages and famines and diseases that had shaped our immune systems, and our pain thresholds, and our capacity for grief and continuation. I thought about everything the earth had put in front of us over a very long time, and everything we had learned from facing it. "Yes," I said, "much worse." Sariath turned to look at me fully. "What happened to it?" I let the sounds of 11 predators wash over the graduation hall of the Galactic Alliance Officer Academy, on a station orbiting a star far from home, surrounded by the future officers of 30 species, all of them experiencing a physical response to 11 documented sources of biological dread. "We happened to it," I said, "and then we moved on to the next thing." The sounds finished. The hall was still. Velra stood at the front, watching me. I met her eyes across the full length of the room. And I kept smiling. Nobody spoke for a very long time. And in that silence, I think the galaxy, or at least this small, carefully trained corner of it, began to understand something it had never had a framework for before. We were not a diplomatic token. We were not an anomaly. We were not an accident of biology or a curiosity of history. We were the end result of everything that had ever tried to stop us. And we were just getting started.